The summer of 1969 hung thick and electric over Las Vegas, a city that never slept but always dreamed. Inside the International Hotel's showroom, the air shimmered with cigarette smoke and the golden glow of 1,000 amber lights. Dean Martin stood at center stage, tuxedo impeccable, martini glass, catching the spotlight like a crystal prayer. His voice rolled through Everybody Loves Somebody with that effortless grace that made heartbreak sound like a lullaby. This was the king of cool in his natural habitat, where every gesture was choreographed by instinct and every pause landed like silk on velvet. But something was different tonight. In the shadows near the stage door, partially concealed by the heavy burgundy curtains that separated performance from reality, stood another king. Elvis Presley had returned to Vegas just weeks earlier, conquering the very stage one floor above in this same hotel. The white jumpsuit, the karate moves, the screaming crowds, all of it had announced to the world that the king of rock and roll was back. Yet here, in the darkness below his own kingdom, Elvis looked like nothing more than a nervous kid from Tupelo, Mississippi. He had come down specifically to see Dean perform, had rehearsed the words he might say, had imagined the moment their eyes would meet, two legends acknowledging each other across the divide of generation and genre. But now, faced with the man whose records he had worn thin on a cheap turntable in his youth, whose effortless cool he had studied like scripture, Elvis found himself frozen. The man who could command 80,000 screaming fans couldn't take 10 steps to shake hands with his hero. A hotel employee later swore he saw Elvis's hands trembling. This was his building now, his name blazing across the desert sky in letters 10 feet high, his revolution that had changed the very DNA of American music. But in the presence of Dean Martin, he was 16 again, watching those old movies in Memphis theaters, memorizing every gesture, every inflection, every way Dean made being a man look like poetry in motion. Dean's eyes swept the room during an instrumental break, that practiced scan of a performer reading his audience. They paused when they found the familiar silhouette half hidden in the wings. In that instant, something shifted behind Dean's carefully constructed facade. The smile remained, but the eyes changed. He saw not the rival headliner, not the younger generation that was supposedly making him obsolete, but something far more fragile, a fellow performer drowning in his own mythology. Without announcement, without fanfare, without turning this into another Vegas spectacle for the gossip columns, Dean Martin did something that would haunt witnesses for the rest of their lives. He set down his microphone mid-song, leaving the orchestra hanging on a suspended note, and stepped off the stage. Not toward the VIP tables where Hollywood royalty sips champagne, not toward the photographers waiting by the bar. He walked directly into the shadows where the king of rock and roll stood paralyzed by his own reverence. What happened in that darkened corner, what Dean whispered so quietly that even the nearby staff could only watch and wonder, would leave Elvis Presley weeping like a child. The carefully constructed armor of the jumpsuit, the pompadour, the swagger, all of it would crumble in the arms of the man who understood better than anyone the crushing weight of making everything look easy when your heart was breaking. Years later, a former hotel busboy would show his grandson a faded Polaroid. Two men embracing in the shadows, no stage lights, no performance, just human connection in its purest form. This, the old man would whisper, was the night I learned that Dean Martin wasn't performing at all. He was saving someone. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, but stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now, let's go back to that August night in 1969 when two kings met in the shadows of the International Hotel. Steubenville, Ohio did not look like the beginning of immortality. It looked like coal dust and river fog. A working-class town where men came home with their knuckles split open and their dreams carefully folded away. On South 6th Street, in a cramped barber shop that always smelled of talc and menthol, a boy named Dino Crescetti learned what it meant to feel small in a world that had no patience for the different. He spoke English with the hesitation of someone translating every thought, each word a negotiation between the Italian of his parents and the sharp-edged slang of American kids who belonged in ways he never would. At school, they laughed at his broken sentences, mocked his accent, turned his name into a playground taunt. On those gray afternoons, hiding behind his father's barbershop pole, young Dino discovered that silence hurt less than their mimicry. Silence became his first defense, the beginning of an armor he would spend a lifetime perfecting. But inside Gaetano's barbershop, the world shifted on its axis. Men entered tired and left laughing. Stories floated through the air like cigarette smoke, and when someone dropped a nickel into the jukebox next door, the clatter of scissors would fall quiet under the spell of melody. Dino watched his father's customers transform when music filled the room. Shoulders relaxed. Eyes softened. The burdens they carried from the steel mills became, for 3 precious minutes, almost bearable. That was his first glimpse of the quiet magic of performance, not as vanity or applause, but as relief, as sanctuary, as the power to make others feel less alone. This is the secret history of Dean Martin's famous cool. It was never arrogance. It was architecture. Brick by careful brick, moment by painful moment, he built a character the way other men build walls. He learned to hide fear inside a shrug, to bury hurt inside a half-smile that suggested nothing could touch him. The heavy-lidded gaze that would later make women swoon was actually the look of a boy constantly scanning rooms for threats, assessing emotional temperatures, ensuring he would never be caught vulnerable again. The martini glass became a prop. The effortless charm became the most carefully rehearsed performance of his career. When he discovered his voice, singing became the ultimate shield. The stuttering immigrant boy vanished, replaced by a smooth baritone that spoke a universal language. But the frightened child from Steubenville never really left him. Because he knew what it felt like to be the outsider, Dean developed a sixth sense for recognizing that same terror in others. While Hollywood saw stars and legends, Dean saw trembling hands and shifting eyes. He could spot a desperate smile from 50 yards away because he had spent years perfecting his own. This instinct became his quiet compass throughout his career. On film sets, when directors snapped too hard at extras, Dean would wander over between takes, a soft aside that meant you matter. He would write anonymous checks in the darkness, his name removed from charity, his kindness mentioned only decades later in the trembling voices of those he had rescued. By 1969, this had evolved from habit into the very core of who he was beneath the performance. So when Dean Martin's eyes found Elvis Presley half hidden in the shadows of the International Hotel that August night, the reaction, the pause mid-song, the tilt of recognition, the silent understanding, didn't come from celebrity acknowledging celebrity. It came from Steubenville, from a barbershop where a frightened child first learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is notice the one person who believes they don't belong, and remind them that they do. By the summer of 1969, Elvis Presley had become something he never intended to be, a monument to his own mythology. The name no longer belonged to the boy who once drove a truck through Memphis, dreaming of something he couldn't name. It belonged to the desert now, burning in neon above the International Hotel like a new constellation fixed permanently in the Vegas sky. The comeback had worked beyond anyone's wildest projections. The 1968 special had reminded the world why they had fallen in love with him in the first place, and now the sold-out crowd screamed with a hunger that shook buildings. On paper, Elvis had reclaimed everything America had promised him: the crown, the kingdom, the roar of validation that could drown out any doubt. But in the suffocating luxury of his penthouse suite, 28 floors above the desert, Elvis paced like a beautiful, caged animal. The previous decade had been a slow burial beneath forgettable movie scripts and soundtracks that turned his voice into wallpaper. The Colonel had transformed him into a product, a brand that generated revenue but had stopped generating meaning. Each film had been another shovel of dirt on the grave of the revolutionary who once terrified parents with nothing more than the movement of his hips. Now, with his resurrection complete, a new and more crushing pressure had settled over him, the weight of maintaining what he had reclaimed. Success had not silenced his demons. It had given them louder voices and better acoustics. There were pills for energy when the spotlight demanded electricity, pills for sleep when the adrenaline refused to fade, pills for pain that wasn't always physical. There was the Colonel, always calculating, turning each vulnerable moment into a transaction, each artistic impulse into a liability. There was his marriage to Priscilla, unraveling in slow motion, each conversation a careful negotiation between two people who had forgotten how to be anything but cautious with each other. In the center of this machinery, Elvis felt increasingly like a component rather than a person, necessary but replaceable, valuable but not valued. In the anxious hours between performances, when the silence in his suite became unbearable, Elvis would slip into a different kind of escape. The past. He would remember being that shy kid pushed forward by friends to sing for strangers, his hands shaking, his voice a raw instrument filled with equal parts hope and terror. Back then, when he wasn't absorbing gospel or the blues that would reshape his soul, he was studying another kind of master, Dean Martin. Elvis didn't just listen to those records, he dissected them with the obsession of a seminary student studying scripture. The lazy phrasing that hovered behind the beat like it had nowhere else to be. The way Dean could lean on a single word and make it feel like a secret shared only with you. The effortless masculinity that made every other man look like he was trying too hard. Elvis was kinetic energy, a raw nerve exposed to the world, burning with a frantic intensity that left him exhausted after every performance. Dean was the antidote, the river that never rushed, the cool breeze that never panicked. To Elvis, Dean possessed the one thing that money and fame and screaming crowds couldn't purchase: peace. The ability to walk through the fire of celebrity without getting burned, to keep a part of himself secret when the whole world demanded to own every piece of you. So when Elvis learned that Dean was performing downstairs in the same building where he was reclaiming his crown, the idea took hold with the force of religious calling. This wasn't about photo opportunities or headlines. This was pilgrimage. He rehearsed simple phrases in the mirror. "Mr. Martin, I just want to say thank you. You've been one of my heroes." And each one felt more ridiculous the moment he imagined actually speaking the words. How do you tell the man whose voice pulled you through your darkest Memphis nights that his cool had saved you? How do you look at the person whose records taught you how to stand, how to smile, how to hide your wounds, and admit that beneath your crown you are still that trembling boy from Tupelo? Standing in the wings that August night, half concealed by heavy burgundy curtains, Elvis felt the profound and terrible irony of his position. He was the most famous man on the planet, the icon whose revolution had rewritten the history of American music, yet he found himself unable to take a single step forward. His hands, adorned with rings worth more than his childhood home, began to tremble. The white jumpsuit that had made him feel invincible on his own stage suddenly seemed like a costume, a child playing dress-up in his father's clothes. The higher you climb in the pantheon of American celebrity, the thinner the air becomes. Elvis was surrounded by an entourage, protected by bodyguards, and worshipped by millions. Yet standing in that darkened corner, he was experiencing a loneliness so acute it was physical. He had forgotten how to be normal, how to simply walk up to another human being and introduce himself. He was trapped in the orbit of his own stardom, looking across the void at the only man he believed might understand the view from the top, terrified that if he reached out, he would discover that even the king of cool couldn't save him from the silence that waited in his own hotel room when the last fan had gone home and the pills stopped working, and all that remained was the echo of his own breathing in rooms too large for any one man to fill. The showroom was a galaxy of table lamps and cigarette embers. 1,000 faces turned toward the stage in rapt adoration. Dean was gliding through Everybody Loves Somebody, letting the melody float over the audience like smoke rings, when something in the corner of his vision snagged his attention. Not a fan, not a waiter, Not another face in the crowd he had learned to read like sheet music. A shadow that didn't belong. He saw the white first, the glint of jeweled belt, the faint shimmer of a jumpsuit designed to be seen from the back row of an arena, now hiding in the wings of a Vegas showroom. Then the unmistakable profile came into focus, that jawline and pompadour. But what stopped Dean wasn't the celebrity of the figure. It was the posture. Shoulders hunched inward, hands clutching each other, head bowed slightly as if waiting for a blow that never came. Dean knew that stance. He had worn it himself, internally, 1,000 times. It was the stance of a man drowning in plain sight while everyone else applauded the water. The orchestra reached the bridge, strings swelling for the crescendo, but the voice that was supposed to meet them never arrived. Dean Martin, the consummate professional who could sleepwalk through a set with perfect timing, simply stopped singing. The silence that followed was jarring, a physical gap in the universe where music was supposed to be. He unclipped the microphone from its stand, set it gently on a stool, and walked off the stage. Not toward the dressing rooms, but directly into the shadows where the king of rock and roll stood frozen. The walk felt endless, deliberate, almost paternal. Dean moved with a purpose that stripped away the Dino persona entirely. The languid drunk act was gone. This was a man walking toward a burning building, someone who understood that rushing would only spook what he was approaching. When he finally stood before Elvis, close enough that no one else could hear, his first words were so unexpected they almost sounded like a joke. "Kid, you gonna stand there all night? Or you gonna come have a drink?" The informality of it, the complete absence of ceremony, cracked something in Elvis's carefully constructed composure. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Dean's eyes, which the cameras always caught half-closed in bored amusement, were fully open now, alert with focused attention that made Elvis feel simultaneously exposed and protected. Dean placed one hand on Elvis's shoulder, the weight of it somehow both light and anchoring, and guided him deeper into the shadows. His voice dropped to a whisper that nearby stagehands strained to hear but couldn't catch. "You know what the hardest part is? It's not the performing. Any fool with a voice can perform. It's carrying what everyone else needs you to be. Their dreams, their disappointments, their idea of who you are." Dean's tone was conversational, like they were old friends continuing a discussion interrupted years ago. "The scared ones are the only ones worth listening to, kid. The rest are just selling snake oil. You're scared right now? And that fear? That's the only honest thing left in this whole damn town." That was the moment Elvis broke. Not a small crack, but a complete structural collapse. His face crumpled, and the sobs that came were the sounds of a child, raw and unguarded. Dean didn't flinch, didn't step back. Instead, he pulled Elvis against his chest the way a father holds a son who has just learned the world is crueler than anyone promised. In the loading dock shadows of the International Hotel, while an orchestra sat frozen on stage and an audience murmured in confused anticipation, two legends held each other up. One man finally allowing himself to be weak, and another showing him that kindness was the only strength that really mattered. What happened in the wings of the International Hotel that August night was not an anomaly in Dean Martin's life. It was the clearest expression of a code he had lived by for decades, mostly in the dark, mostly when no one was paying attention. Dean had never trusted noisy heroes, the ones who made grand gestures with photographers conveniently nearby, the ones who turned kindness into currency. Maybe it was Steubenville still whispering inside him, or all those years standing next to louder men like Frank Sinatra, but he had come to believe that the purest acts were the ones nobody ever heard about. Real strength moved softly. It didn't need an audience. On the set of Rio Bravo in 1959, there was a young extra whose single line had been butchered in take after take. The director's patience had evaporated into cruelty, each retake accompanied by louder sighs and sharper insults. Dean had watched this humiliation unfold during his own coverage, saying nothing, his face betraying nothing. Then, between setups, he walked over to the trembling extra and whispered something that made the young man's eyes widen. When cameras rolled again, Dean flubbed his own line. Then flubbed it again. And again. By the fifth take, the director's fury had shifted entirely to the star, and the extra's mistake was forgotten, absorbed into the larger chaos. Dean never acknowledged what he had done. The extra worked in Hollywood for another 40 years and never forgot the man who had saved his dignity with deliberate imperfection. There were the musicians in Vegas lounges, talented players grinding through 4 shows a night for wages that barely covered rent. Dean would wander in after his own performances, sit at the bar, and listen. Then envelopes would appear in dressing rooms, thick with cash and no return address. There was the widow of a stagehand who died in a scaffolding accident, suddenly receiving monthly checks that continued for years. When recipients tried to thank him, Dean would look genuinely confused, as if he had no idea what they were talking about. His accountant knew better. The ledger was filled with anonymous payments, charitable donations with strict instructions that his name never be attached. Within the Rat Pack, the roles were clearly defined. Frank commanded rooms with volcanic charisma, demanding attention and loyalty with equal intensity. Sammy dazzled crowds with talent so immense it could break through any barrier. But Dean was the emotional ballast, the one they called when the lights went down and the real problems emerged. He understood that true power whispered instead of shouted, that the deepest kind of strength required no announcement. Elvis absorbed this lesson in that darkened corner, held in the arms of a man who had just stopped his own show to rescue someone else's dignity. In the years that followed, stories would emerge of Elvis's own anonymous generosity, the struggling families who found their mortgages mysteriously paid, the musicians who received instruments they could never afford, delivered with no card, no explanation. The pattern Dean had shown him that night became a blueprint Elvis would follow until his own lights went dark. The hotel busboy who witnessed the embrace understood even then that he was seeing something sacred. He had worked Vegas long enough to recognize performance, and this wasn't it. He pulled a Polaroid camera from his jacket and captured the moment, not for profit or gossip, but because some moments deserve to be remembered when everything else fades. That photograph would survive in a shoebox for 50 years, showing what the audience never saw. 2 kings who had finally found someone who understood that crowns are heaviest when you wear them in private, and that real heroism happens in the shadows where the cameras can't reach. The cruelest mathematics of human kindness is this: the more you teach others to be vulnerable, the harder it becomes to claim that vulnerability for yourself. Dean Martin had spent decades perfecting the art of being present for everyone else's breaking points, while keeping his own pain locked behind a smile that fooled the world but never fooled the mirror. The armor he had forged in his father's barbershop, strengthened through years of quiet heroism, had become so effective at protecting others that it eventually sealed him away from his own salvation. The cool that saved Elvis that August night was the same cool that would prevent Dean from reaching out when his own foundations began to crumble. Elvis understood what he had been given in those Vegas shadows, and he tried desperately to honor it. In the months following their encounter, he began drafting letters on Grassland stationery during the hollow hours before dawn, when the pills wore thin and loneliness felt like it might consume him entirely. Long, rambling confessions about fear and gratitude, about how that single moment had reminded him that strength and vulnerability weren't opposites but partners in the same dance. But something about Dean's self-containment suggested he didn't need reassurance, didn't want the burden of someone else's emotional dependence. So the letters remained in drawers, unfinished symphonies of gratitude, while Elvis settled for public praise instead, hoping his words would somehow travel through interviews and acceptance speeches to reach the man who had held him when he shattered. The lesson Dean had taught him took root in unexpected ways. Elvis began his own quiet campaign of anonymous generosity, paying mortgages for struggling families, sending instruments to musicians who couldn't afford them, always with strict instructions that his name never be attached. He had learned from Dean that real power whispered instead of shouted, that the deepest acts of love required no audience, But as the 70s wore on, both men found themselves fighting battles that no amount of applause could silence. Elvis retreated into his chemical fortress, surrounded by enablers who fed his addictions while starving his soul. Dean, facing his own quieter demons, began the slow withdrawal from the world that would define his final act. When the news broke that August afternoon in 1977 that the king was dead, found alone on a bathroom floor in a mansion that had become a mausoleum, Dean received it the way he received most devastation, in complete silence. He attended the funeral without fanfare, choosing a spot near the back where cameras couldn't find him, watching the spectacle of public grief with dry eyes that those who knew him recognized as the opposite of indifference. He had lost the one person who truly understood the weight of crowns, the only other man who knew what it cost to make magic look effortless. The final blow came a decade later with the death of his son Dean Paul in a plane crash, a loss that shattered the cool facade permanently. The man who had spent 60 years making heartbreak look manageable discovered that some wounds were too deep for performance. He ghosted through his remaining years, present but unreachable, the legendary detachment hardening into genuine isolation. When Dean died in 1995, among his carefully guarded possessions was an envelope, yellowed with age, postmarked Memphis, August 1977. The letter inside, written in Elvis's unmistakable handwriting just months before his death, had never been opened. Dean had carried it for 18 years, close enough to feel its weight but unable to let even a dead man's vulnerability penetrate the walls he had spent a lifetime building. The unopened letter remained his final secret, proof that even the man who saved everyone else couldn't save himself, but that love, once given, leaves echoes that survive even the deepest silence. 50 years after that August night, in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Las Vegas, the past surfaced from the bottom of a shoebox like a message in a bottle washing up on an unexpected shore. Marcus Sullivan was 73 now, his hands spotted with age, his back bent from decades of carrying trays and cleaning tables in hotels that had risen and fallen like desert mirages. His grandson Michael had come to help sort through a lifetime of accumulated memories, expecting nothing more than old pay stubs and faded show tickets. Marcus had been 23 in 1969, working double shifts at the International Hotel to send money back to his mother in Detroit, navigating the back hallways with the invisible efficiency of someone the famous world never bothered to see. He had witnessed enough Vegas excess to become numb to celebrity, enough backstage chaos to understand that most of what glittered was performance. But when his fingers found that single Polaroid, yellowed at the edges and curled by time, the decades collapsed like a house of cards. The image was technically imperfect in every way that mattered to professionals. Poorly lit, slightly blurred, the colors faded into sepia tones that made everything look like a half-remembered dream. But it had captured something that 1,000 glossy publicity stills never could. Two men in a shadowed corner, no stage lights, no audience, no performance. Just the king of rock and roll collapsed against the king of cool, held in an embrace that had nothing to do with the personas the world knew. One man's face buried in another's shoulder, both of them stripped of every layer of mythology that fame had wrapped around them like burial shrouds. Michael squinted at the photograph, recognition dawning slowly. "Is that Elvis?" Marcus nodded, his voice dropping to the reverent whisper he reserved for sacred things. And Dean Martin. August 1969. The night I learned that legends were just people who had traveled farther from home than the rest of us. He explained how he had turned a corner carrying dirty glasses when he froze, understanding instinctively that he was witnessing something that belonged to a different category of human experience entirely. This wasn't celebrity meeting celebrity. This was one soul recognizing another across the void that success had carved between them and the rest of humanity. The Polaroid he snapped was against hotel policy, but instinct had overridden regulation. Some moments, he knew even then, deserved to be remembered when everything else faded. For half a century, Marcus had kept that photograph private, occasionally pulling it out when the world felt too harsh, when the machinery of modern life ground too loudly against his spirit. It became his reminder that beneath every performance, behind every carefully constructed image, people were just people carrying weights they hoped someone else might help them bear. He never sold it, never showed it to tabloids who would have paid fortunes for proof that Elvis Presley had wept in Dean Martin's arms. Some moments were too sacred for commerce, too pure for the marketplace of public consumption. In an era where every act of kindness arrives pre-packaged for social media, carefully lit and captioned for maximum effect, that hidden embrace feels almost otherworldly. Dean didn't stop his show to be seen doing the right thing. Elvis didn't crumble for cameras. There were no publicists crafting narratives, no charity galas, no interviews boasting about what a good man Dean was. If not for a busboy with a guilty conscience and a cheap instant camera, the world would never have known the moment existed at all. And maybe that was exactly the point. The International Hotel showroom still stands, though it has been renovated and renamed so many times that its original identity has been buried beneath layers of corporate rebranding. But late at night, when the cleaning crews finish their rounds and the ghost light burns alone on the empty stage, there is a quality to the silence that feels inhabited. Not haunted exactly, but remembered, as if the walls themselves absorbed that August night and cannot quite forget the moment when two kings stopped performing and started saving each other. Michael looked from the photograph to his grandfather's weathered face and back again, something shifting quietly inside him. The legends on his streaming playlists, the voices that had soundtracked his childhood, suddenly felt less like distant gods and more like relatives he had never met but somehow understood. The myth shrank, but the men grew larger, more real, more worthy of the reverence that had kept this photograph safe for 50 years. Dean Martin and Elvis Presley never spoke publicly about what happened in those wings. No interviews dissected the moment. No memoirs revealed the whispered words that broke one man open and reminded another why kindness mattered more than cool. The world continued to see the drunk and the jumpsuit, the punchlines and the pelvis, the carefully curated images that sold records and filled arenas. But somewhere in the architecture of that Vegas hotel, in a faded Polaroid carried in an old man's wallet, in the ripples of anonymous generosity that both men practiced until their final days, the truth survived like an underground river, nourishing everything it touched. History remembers their performances because performances are loud and public and easy to document. But that night in the shadows, they weren't performing at all. They were two scared kids from Steubenville and Tupelo who had traveled impossible distances to reach the top of the mountain, only to discover that the view from the summit was mostly loneliness. What Dean gave Elvis in that embrace was permission to be human inside the mythology, to carry fear alongside fame, to understand that the crown was heaviest not because of what it represented to the world, but because of what it cost the man who wore it. As the final credits roll on this story, imagine that showroom one last time. The audience has long since gone home. The orchestra pit is empty. The ghost light burns on stage, casting long shadows across velvet seats that have absorbed decades of dreams and disappointments. But if you listen closely, in the silence that follows all applause, you might just hear it, the faint echo of a whisper in the wings, a reminder from one frightened soul to another that they don't have to carry the weight of the world alone. That maybe, just maybe, the only kind of royalty that ever really matters is the kind that knows how to kneel down in the dark and help someone else stand up. And perhaps that transaction, invisible to cameras and unrecorded by history, is the truest performance any of us can give.